I have carried this for 32 years, and I'm going to tell it now because Eunice is gone, and because I am 73 years old and my knees are going, and I want it out of me before I cannot speak clearly enough to say it right. I stood at a forestry road pull-out northeast of Chetwynd on a Sunday morning in the summer of 1998, Hatch sitting at my left boot, looking up at me the way he did when he thought I was taking too long at something. And I understood in that moment that I had spent the better part of my adult life guarding a truth I was never equipped to argue with. My Aunt Eunice was missing for 3 years. Search and rescue looked for 17 days and stopped. She came back alive. And the reason she came back alive is the thing I am telling you now, the thing she told me in pieces in the summer of 1971, the thing I swore to her I would never repeat while she was living. She died in 2003 at 81 years old. I consider myself released. To understand how a woman could walk out of the northern BC interior after 3 years and be anything other than a skeleton, you need to understand the country. I spent 34 years as a timber cruiser in the Peace region and the foothills east of the Rockies, from my first block layout in 1968 to my last cruise report filed in the spring of 2002. I know that country the way you know a difficult relative. I know where the Muskwa drains and where the halfway goes thin in late August. I know what a blowdown sounds like at night versus what a standing tree sounds like when it has decided to come down. I know the difference between a black bear press in the mud and the other kind, and I'm the kind of man who, when he sees the other kind, writes down the dimensions before he moves on, rather than pretending he did not see it. That is the nature of the work. You measure what is there, you record it. You do not invent and you do not omit. I tell you this, not to impress you. I tell you this because the account I am giving you has no value at all without a man behind it who has spent a working lifetime telling the truth about what the land holds, even when the truth is inconvenient for the inventory report. My name is Shane Thornton. I grew up in a small house on the edge of Chetwynd, the second child of 3, and my Aunt Eunice was my mother's older sister by 11 years. She had married once, in the late 1940s, and her husband had died of a ruptured appendix in the winter of 1954. And after that, she had stayed in the country rather than coming back to town. She had a trapline registered with the provincial office, license number I no longer have in front of me, but which my mother kept photocopied in the file box she stored under her bed for the rest of her life. The line ran northwest of Chetwynd into the Hart Ranges foothills, roughly 40 miles out along a track that barely qualified as a road in September and did not qualify at all by November. Eunice ran it alone. She had been running it alone for 9 years by 1965. She knew that country the way I later came to know mine. She was not a woman who made errors in the field. She left her home at the edge of the property on the 7th of September, 1965. I know that date because it was 2 days after my birthday, and she had come to the house the evening of the 5th with a piece of spruce gum she had cleaned and wrapped in paper, which was what she always brought because she knew I liked it, and because she was not a woman who spent money on things that could be made. She told my mother she would be at the line camp for 10 days, checking her sets and doing the repairs she had been putting off since spring. She said she would be back before the end of the 3rd week of September. She was not back at the end of the 3rd week of September. My mother, whose name was Doris, waited 4 days past the expected return before she called Roy Burrell, who was the county search coordinator at that time out of the forestry office on the highway. Roy was a careful man and a decent one. He organized a search that put teams into the area on the 24th of September, and those teams worked for 17 days across some of the roughest terrain the region holds. They found Eunice's camp. They found her equipment in the tent, her packs, her trap tools, her extra boots. They found a cook fire that had been maintained and then abandoned. And they found one set of tracks in a frost patch near the creek that was consistent with her boot size going north along the drainage and not coming back. After 17 days, Roy Burrell told my mother he was sorry, and the file was closed with a presumption of death. That is consistent with the search conventions of that period. 17 days of ground search in September and October in the northern BC interior. No body, no signal, no response to calls, no return to known shelter. The conclusion was not unreasonable. It was simply wrong. My mother did not accept it. She never said much about it directly. She was not a woman who made public speeches about what she believed. But she kept that file box under her bed with the Trapline license copy, the search coordinator's contact sheets, the 2 newspaper notices that ran in the Fort St. John paper in October 1965, and the letter from the provincial office confirming the presumption. She kept those papers for 38 years. She was still keeping them the morning she died in 2001, and I found them when I was clearing her room, which is how I know exactly what those 17 days looked like from the outside. I was 15 years old when Eunice disappeared. I did not fully understand what a presumption of death meant in legal terms. What I understood was that my mother had stopped sleeping properly, that she answered the telephone on the first ring for months afterward, and that she refused to let anyone put Eunice's winter coat in the Goodwill pile when they cleaned out her house the following spring. She packed it into a cardboard box and put it in our attic, where it stayed. The winter of 1965 passed. The winter of 1966 passed. The winter of 1967 passed. 3 winters in the northern BC interior without the supply lines, without the shelter arrangements, without any of the things a person plans for before they go into that country. I was 18 by the spring of 1968, and I had already been working summer labour for 2 years with a cruising crew out of the Dawson Creek office, and I understood by then what 3 winters alone in the foothills actually meant. It meant your body was a closed account. It meant the search party had been right. A forestry road crew found Eunice on the 14th of May, 1968, at a fire camp they had established near an access track northeast of Chetwynd. The crew foreman, a man named Aldous Sett, had gone to start the morning fire and found a woman sitting on a log at the edge of the cleared area, wearing clothes he did not recognize as any brand or cut he knew, watching him. He said later that she did not look like a person who had spent 3 years in the bush. He said she was thin but not starved, that her feet were covered in wrapped hide that she had made herself, and that she looked at him with an expression that he could only describe, according to the account my mother saved, as someone who had been waiting and had grown patient about it. Aldous asked her name. She told him. He drove her to the nearest junction where he could raise a signal and called it in. My mother took the call at 6 in the morning. I was in the kitchen when it came. I heard her say, very quietly, "I knew it. I knew she was alive." And then she sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the oilcloth and did not move for a long time. Not from shock, I think. From relief that had been held under pressure for 2.5 years and had finally been given somewhere to go. They drove to get Eunice that same day. I went with my mother. Eunice was at the Chetwynd medical office by the time we arrived, and the doctor, a young man named Patterson who had come up from Prince George the year before, was cautious with her in the way doctors are when they expect to find something wrong and keep not finding it. She was underweight by perhaps 15 or 20 pounds. She had some scar tissue on her left hand from what looked like a managed burn, healed years old. Her blood work came back with nothing that alarmed Patterson, though he told my mother privately that her nutritional state was better than it had any business being given the timeline. He used the phrase better than expected twice in that conversation. My mother heard both times. Eunice came home to our house because her own property had been let go during the 3 years, and the house needed work before it was livable again. She slept in the back bedroom, the one that had been my older sister's before she moved to Prince George. She ate well and did not talk much. She spent time on the porch in the evenings looking at the Treeline. Hatch was a dog I would not get for another dozen years, so there was no dog then, but there was a barn cat named February that Eunice had given us the year before she disappeared, and that cat would sit beside her on the porch every evening without fail. Animals have a sense for certain things. I have found that to be a reliable fact across a long working life, and I note it without trying to make more of it than it is. Over the months that followed, Eunice said fragments of things. Not to my mother. My mother would have asked, and Eunice shut down around direct questions the way a gate shuts. She said them to me, mostly in passing, the way a person mentions something they have been thinking about without meaning to open it up. I was 18 and 19 during that time, and I was already moving toward the work that would be my life. And I think she spoke to me partly because I was young enough that she did not expect me to fully understand it, and partly because I was already someone who worked with measurements and did not embellish. She told me once, while we were splitting wood in the side yard, that she had not been cold. She said it like she was answering a question I had not asked. She set her wedge and hit it once and said, "I was not cold, not the way I should have been." I did not say anything. She split the round and set the next one. She did not say anything more about it that day. She told me another time when we were in the truck driving out to check on her property repairs that she had not been alone. She said it looking out the passenger window, not at me, and she said it in the same tone she might have used to say that the weather had been decent that week. I kept my eyes on the road. I had learned already that the way to hear the rest of a thing from Eunice was to give it room. She said, "There were several of them. A family, I suppose you would call it. I think there was one younger one." Then she went quiet, and we drove the rest of the way without speaking. Those were the fragments I had before the summer of 1971. In June of that year, I came home from a 3-month cruising contract north of Fort Nelson. Eunice was living back in her own house by then, her property repaired, her trapline re-registered. She had not gone back to running it alone the way she had before, and she never would, but she was living on the property and keeping a garden, and she seemed steady in a way that she had not been in the first year back. I stopped to see her on my way through, and she had coffee on the stove and she poured me a cup without asking, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we always had. She talked around it for a while the way she did. She asked about the Fort Nelson contract, and I told her about the terrain and the cut we had estimated. She nodded in the way of someone who respects competent work without needing the details. Then she set her cup down and looked at me directly and said, "I am going to tell you what I remember of it, and then I am going to ask you something." I said, "All right." She talked for perhaps 45 minutes. She did not tell it in order. She told it the way a person tells something they have been carrying for a long time, not as a rehearsed story, but as pieces that surface in the order they come. I am going to tell you what she told me, and I'm going to tell it in the order that makes sense to a listener, because that is the best service I can do for what she said. She had been at the line camp for 4 days when she went north along the creek to check a set she had placed in a drainage she knew well. She had been checking that drainage for 9 years. On the 4th day, coming back south, she slipped on a frost-slicked bank and went into the creek at a narrow point where the water was moving fast, and the channel was deeper than it looked. She went under, came up, went under again, and came up against a gravel bar about 100 yards downstream where the creek bent and slowed. She pulled herself out, She was in the air temperature of an early September evening in the northern foothills, soaking wet, 1.5 miles from the camp, and she had twisted the left ankle badly enough that she could not put weight on it, without the kind of pain that tells you something is genuinely wrong. She started back. She covered perhaps half the distance before the light went. She found a downfall big enough to provide some shelter on its leeward side, and she got in under it and curled up, and did what you do, which is stay small and stay awake, and tell yourself you will move again at first light. She was not a person who panicked. She had been in difficult situations in that country before. She told herself she would manage it in the morning. She said she was aware of something before she saw anything. Not a sound, or not a sound she could identify as a specific thing. A change in the quality of the air near her, the way the space close to you shifts when something large is present. She lay still. She had been still already. She said she thought, in a clear and practical way, that it might be a bear investigating the smell of the creek water on her clothes, and she went through the choices available to her, which were limited. What came to the edge of the downfall was not a bear. She could not see it clearly in the dark. She said it was large in the way that makes other large things feel ordinary by comparison, and it was close enough that she could hear it breathing with a slow steadiness that did not suggest alarm. It crouched, she thought, though she could not be certain of the posture. It did not make a sound beyond the breathing. It stayed there for what she estimated was several minutes. Then it did something she spent the next 6 years trying to find a rational account for, and never did. It began to lay branches and debris along the open side of the downfall, filling in the gap that the falling tree had left between the main trunk and the ground. Not randomly, deliberately, the way you would pack insulation into a gap you wanted to close. She could hear the care in how it placed each piece, the slight adjustment and settling, the patience of something that had decided to do a specific thing and was going to do it correctly. When it was finished, the space around her was significantly less cold. Not warm, less cold. It did not leave immediately. She heard it settle back, farther from the downfall, and she heard the slow breathing continue at the same pace as before. When she woke in the thin light of early morning, she was alone. She found her way back to camp on the turned ankle over the course of that morning. She said it took her 4 hours to cover 1.5 miles. She got to the camp, and she sat inside the tent, and she thought about what she was going to do. The ankle was swollen and would not support her weight for walking out. The camp had supplies enough for another week. She decided she would rest it, and she would heal, and she would walk out when she could. She was not alone again the following night. She saw it in the edge of the tree line at dusk, standing still. It was the first time she saw it clearly, in the low, angled light that the northern foothills make in late September. And she told me that what she remembered most was the scale of it and the fact that it did not move like something afraid. It stood and looked at the camp, and she stood at the tent entrance and looked back at it. And she said that the looking was a two-way thing, that there was a quality to being seen by it that was different from being seen by any animal she had encountered in 9 years in that country. She did not run. She did not shout. She said she stood there until it turned and walked back into the trees, and she felt the absence of it the way you feel the absence of a sound that you have stopped hearing. The ankle did not heal cleanly. 3 weeks in, she knew she was not walking out. She had enough sense to begin managing her supplies for an extended stay, and she had the equipment in the camp to do that. She had the trap tools and the wire, and she had the canvas she used for repairs. She made what she needed to make. She was a competent woman in that country. But what she needed most was food over the winter, and food over the winter meant a supply she could not produce alone with a damaged ankle, and no ability to range far from camp. She did not go hungry. She found over the weeks that followed that things were left at the edge of the clearing. Not every night, some mornings. A gutted animal laid neatly, larger than anything she could have taken herself at that range, without the ankle-bearing weight. Fish in the summer months, near the creek crossing. Twice roots she recognized as edible, gathered in a quantity that told her something understood what they were for. She told me she did not see how the provision was made, most of the time. She saw it happen directly only twice. The first time she was at the creek with a cook pot and she looked up, and one of them, a larger one she had come to think of as distinct from the others by the width of the shoulders, was standing 20 feet from her with a doe across both arms, holding it the way you would hold something you intended to set down carefully. It stood still until she nodded, which she said she did without thinking about it, and then it placed the animal on the bank and moved back into the trees without hurry. I have been a careful man about the way I have told this story. I told it to my wife, Clara, in 1985, and she listened without interrupting, and then sat quietly for a long time and said she believed me because I was not the kind of man who invented things. I told it to no one else until now. Eunice asked me at the end of that June morning in 1971 to hold it until she was gone. She said she did not want the questions while she was living. She said people would come and want to go look, and she did not want that. I said I understood. She said, "You are the only person I have told the full shape of it to." I took that seriously. I have held it seriously for 32 years. What I know of the 3 years, beyond what Eunice told me, comes from what I observed of her after the return, and from what I found when I went back to the site myself. In the late summer of 1975, I ran a cruising contract that took me within 12 miles of the drainage where Eunice's camp had been. On my own time, on a Sunday, I drove as close as the road allowed and walked in. It took me about 4 hours. The camp was still there, or the remnants of it. The tent frame had come down and the canvas had rotted into the ground, but the cook area was still visible and the creek was where it had always been. I found the remains of the downfall Eunice had described, though 7 years of settling had made it harder to read. I found what I came to find, which was a series of depressions in the soft earth along the northwest edge of the clearing, each one roughly 22 inches across, and set in an irregular line that no deer and no bear makes. I measured them with the tape I always carry. I crouched over each one and I looked at it the way I look at everything in the field, which is without hurry and without a predetermined conclusion. Then I sat down on the creek bank with my back to the water, and I thought about what I was sitting inside, which was a piece of country that had kept a woman alive for 3 winters, in ways I had no workable explanation for, and I thought about how the account I had heard from her in 1971 was the only explanation that accounted for all of the facts I had in front of me. Hatch was not with me on that particular day. He came into my life a few years after, a shepherd cross from a colleague's litter who turned out to have more sense than most people I have worked with. He went with me everywhere on the cruising contracts after that, riding in the truck cab and sleeping at the foot of the cot in whatever camp we were at. In the summer of 1998, when I drove out to the junction road northeast of Chetwynd, the one where Aldous Sett's crew had found Eunice in May of 1968, Hatch was in the cab beside me. He was an old dog by then and moved slowly on cold mornings, but he was sharp enough where it counted. I parked at the pull-out above the junction and got out. Hatch came down from the cab and went to the grass at the road edge, and then came and sat at my left boot and looked up at me. The trees ran in a solid line about 30 yards from where I stood. The morning was clear and the air had that September quality that the northern foothills have, dry and cold-edged even in summer when the sun has not been up long. I stood there for a while. I was not looking for anything in particular. I had come partly because I was working in the area and partly because I had been carrying the account for 27 years by then, and I sometimes needed to stand in the physical country where it had happened in order to feel that it was real. I heard nothing from the tree line. I saw nothing. Hatch sat beside me and did not look toward the trees any more than he looked at anything else, which is to say he was alert but not alarmed, which was his natural state in the field. I have thought, in the years since, about what it must have been like for Eunice in those first weeks. A woman of 43, a woman who had been self-sufficient in hard country for the better part of a decade, injured and unable to walk out, coming to understand gradually that she was not going to manage this alone. Coming to understand further that the help being offered was from something she had no framework to receive it from. She was a practical woman. She did not, as far as I know, have any particular set of beliefs about what the country might hold beyond what she had observed in it. She received what was offered because the alternative was to not receive it, and she was too sensible for that. She told me at the end of the 45 minutes in 1971 that she had never been approached directly by any of them except the one time at the creek bank with the doe. She said they kept a distance that felt respectful, if that word applied, and that over the months and then the years she had stopped feeling watched in a way that unsettled her, and had started feeling watched in a way that was simply a quality of the place, like the sound of the creek or the angle of the light in the afternoon. She said she thought there were 4 or 5 of them, though she was never able to confirm a number. She said the younger one she had mentioned would sometimes come to the edge of the clearing in the daytime when the others were not visible, and stand there looking at the camp with a directness that reminded her, she said, of the way children look at things they find interesting before they have learned to hide it. I am not going to tell you what I think they were, because I do not think that kind of naming is mine to do. I am a man who measures what is in front of him and records it, and does not invent. And what I can record is that a woman survived 3 winters in the northern BC interior after a debilitating injury, that her nutritional state on return was better than the physician expected, that she was clothed in materials she had clearly made herself, from materials she had not gone into the country with, and that the account she gave me of how that happened was the only account that fit all of those facts together. I have tried in the years since she told me to find an alternative account that fits as well. I have not found one. She ran her trapline for another 12 years, until her late 60s, before her own body made it impractical. She ran a shorter line, and she ran it in a way that kept her closer to the road than she had run before 1965. She never explained that change to me directly. I did not ask. I thought I understood it without asking, which is that she had a clear sense, after the return, of what the country held and what her own limits were inside it, and she ran her line accordingly. She was practical to the end. She told me one other thing in that June morning in 1971, near the end of what she said. She told me that, on the morning she left, she had known she was going to be able to leave. Not because the ankle had fully healed, though it had healed enough to bear weight by then. Because of something she could not explain and did not try to. She said she woke that last morning, and the clearing was empty in the particular way it was when they were all absent rather than simply out of sight, and she packed what she could carry, and she walked south along the drainage towards the access track. She walked for 2 days. She came out at a logging spur she recognized and followed it to the forestry road where Aldous Sett found her sitting on the log at dawn. She said she looked back several times on the first day, walking south. She did not see anything, but she said that until she reached the forestry road, she did not feel entirely alone. She said it the way she said most things, plainly and without trying to make it more than it was. After Eunice died in October of 2003, I drove out to Chetwynd for the small service. There were not many people. She had outlasted most of her friends, and she had never remarried, and she had lived on the property quietly for the last 2 decades of her life. My mother had been gone 2 years by then. I thought about Doris the whole drive up. I thought about the file box under the bed, the Treeline license copy, the search coordinator's contact sheets, the 2 newspaper notices. I thought about her sitting at the kitchen table in May of 1968, with her hands flat on the oilcloth, the relief of someone who had been right about something for 2.5 years and had just been told the evidence had finally agreed with her. She had been right. She had been right the whole time. And she had been right in the particular way that mattered most, which was not that Eunice was alive, though she was, but that something in the country had not abandoned her. That the world my mother had suspected existed, one larger and more careful than the search reports and the presumption notice and the official version of what a person could survive, had, in fact, been there the whole time. She had believed that without evidence, on the basis of something I could not have measured or recorded. I think about that now, at 73, and I respect it. I drove out to the pullout above the junction road one more time that October. The trees had gone to their fall colour, the larches yellow at the high elevation, the lower growth brown and ready to close down for the winter. Hatch was at home by then, old enough that I did not take him on the long drives anymore. He had his spot by the wood stove and I left him there. I stood at the edge of the road for a while. The air was cold and still, and the light came through the larches at a low angle that turned everything amber and particular. I did not hear anything from the tree line. I did not see anything. I was not expecting to. I was not there to look for something. I was there because I was finally going to tell this story, and I wanted to stand in the country one more time before I did. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be a person who carries a true thing and knows it is true and has no way to prove it to anyone who needs proof. I have been that person for 32 years. I have learned to inhabit it without it ruining me. My mother kept Eunice's winter coat in the attic for 36 years. When I cleared the attic after she died, I found it still in the cardboard box, still folded. I brought it home. I do not know why exactly. It is on the shelf in my spare room now, beside the fireproof box where I keep the copy I made of my mother's file papers. I have not been back to the line camp. I am not sure my knees would get me there anymore, and I am not sure it matters. What I know is what Eunice told me, and what I measured at the site, and what I watched in her in the years after the return, the steadiness of a woman who had been given something she did not ask for and had received it with the plain good sense to be grateful. She never made a story of it. She never looked for credit for surviving. She went back to the property and the garden and the shortened trapline, and she lived her life to 81 in the company of whatever she understood about the country after 1968, which was clearly more than she was going to explain to anyone. I am not a man who needs you to believe this. I have not spent 32 years needing that. What I needed was to say it out loud to someone fully, before I could no longer say it clearly, and I have done that now. You are the one I have said it to, and I'm asking you to carry it with the care I think it deserves. If you ever stand at the edge of a tree line in the northern country, in the early morning when the light is cold and flat and the trees are still, and you feel the particular quality of being watched that does not feel like threat, I want you to remember this account, not to explain it, not to go looking, just to remember that there is a version of the world that is larger than the search reports and the closed files and the presumption notices, and that it has sometimes, in this country, chosen to be careful with people who needed it. Hatch is at the wood stove right now. I can hear him settle in his sleep. The coffee I made an hour ago is cold. The larches out the window are already turning, which means September is further along than it feels, and I'm going to be all right. That is the whole of it.